And good morning, good morning, good morning. How's everybody doing? Dr. Chris Roddenberry coming to you live from Western New York at the Chautauqua Institution. How's everybody doing today? I see we have a couple of people on the broadcast. I just want to say good morning. If you're there, go ahead and type a hello in the chat bar and let me know how you're doing. It is Thursday of week 7, so we are almost done with this class. Now, remember, all we have to do today is we have to do the discussion board that's due tonight at 11:59 p.m. And then we have homework number 7, which is due tomorrow night at 11:59 p.m. Good morning, Marcella. Good to see you. Thanks for coming today. It's good to see everybody here on the broadcast. We are in week 7. Discussion board tonight. And the homework assignment is due tomorrow at 11:59, right? Now, I do want to make a quick note. I'm going to send an announcement out about this, but next week we will not have a discussion board. Next week's collaboration activity is going to be to complete the course evaluation for this course, okay? So I don't know if any of you, how many of you, hold on, I'm sorry, my screen's going to change. Back to the video, sorry. There you go. Okay, so in order to fill out the student evaluation, you're going to go to mywaketech.edu right here. Let's see. Can I show this? We have it right here. So, in order to complete your course evaluation, let's go to the screenshot. I'll just show that to you tomorrow. Good morning, Gustavo. I just wanted to make a quick notice that next week, instead of having a discussion board activity, you're going to have to do your course evaluation for this class. And you can find that by going to the mywaketech.edu account. I can't seem to get it to log in right now. Good morning, Lewis. How are you doing today? Is my sound coming through well? Is my video coming through well? Is my audio coming through well? Video and audio. Are they coming through well? Fantastic. I hope they are. Good deal. All right. Cool. As long as everything's going good. So don't forget to do the course evaluation that is due next week. You can find that in the MyWakeTech, website, the mywaketech.edu, your student portal. And I'll have a little demonstration for you later. Okay, sounds good. And how about you? I'm doing great. I've got to go shopping after we finish class here for dinner tonight. We are completely out of food here at the house, so it's time to go shopping. And then I have to get to the gym and do my workout today. Lewis, but that's all I've got on plan for today. Hope everybody's doing well. All right, so we're talking about the second half of chapter 13 today, the self and personality. If you remember yesterday, I talked to you a little bit about what a self-schema is, what self-esteem is, and I talked to you about a couple of theories that describe how the self or a person's personality develops. Today, we're going to approach personality from a measurement aspect. So we're going to be talking about the psychometric approach today. Psycho means mind, metric means measure. So the area of the mind, psychometricians are the psychologists who are interested in creating the tests that measure our mental constructs and abilities. So we're going to be talking about the trait approach today, Hans Eysenk's biological trait theory. Then we're going to talk about the Big Five trait personality test. Then we're going to talk about the difference between self-report versus projective personality tests. If you were in webinar last night, you heard me talk about the difference between self-report and projective personality tests. Okay, now the trait approach. One way we can look at human personality is we can say, you know what, I don't care where your personality comes from. I don't care how it develops. What I want to know is there a way to reliably measure the qualities that differentiate your personality from somebody else's personality? Is there any way I can describe what your personality looks like? People from the trait approach are interested in creating personality tests that measure individual differences. And really, the trait approach kind of asks three questions. How is everyone like you? How are some people like you? And how is no one like you? So when a psychologist designs a personality trait, they're designing a personality test that will measure everybody's personality. So what are the traits that I need to measure in a personality test to make sure that everybody gets measured by this personality test? So what are the traits that all of us have in some degree, have similarly to some degree? And then you can use these personality tests to make groupings, to compare introverts versus extroverts, to compare people who are open-minded versus people who are conventional. And then these personality tests can give us individual responses that specifically describe you, Louis, or you, Gustavo, and differentiate you from every other person on the planet. So when we take the personality test that you're going to be doing for tonight's discussion board, you're going to find that that personality test measures everybody on 5 traits. So it says that everybody has some degree of these 5 traits. Now, using that test, I can also put you into introverts and extroverts. I can group you into categories of people with similarities. And then each and every one of us is going to have a unique set of scores on those 35 personality measures. So in a sense, the trait approach seeks to ask these 3 questions. What are the traits we need to test everybody? Are there ways in which we can group people based on these tests? And can these tests uniquely identify your signature character personality, right? Now, who's going to be interested in psychology tests? You remember we've been talking about the subfields of psychology all semester long, right? What subfields of psychology would be interested in personality tests? Well, of course, they had these people called personality psychologists who help create these personality tests based upon their theories of what personality must or must not look like. Industrial psychologists, yes, Marcella. Clinical, yes, Marcella. Anything else? Holy cow, very good. Clinical psychologists would be interested in it too. And industrial psychologists, you're adding a lot of them that I don't even have here. I just wanted to differentiate between personality psychologists and quantitative psychologists. There are actually a group of people who are psychologists and statistical experts. And these people are good at evaluating and telling us whether or not the tests we make are good or not. These psychologists are called quantitative psychologists. And in fact, at UNC Chapel Hill, there is a quant psych program where you can learn how to be an expert at statistics and psychology at the same time. And then Marcella showing me up here. Thank you very much, Marcella. You are perfect. You would see clinical psychologists use these personality tests in their clinical settings. And then industrial psychologists use this. There are jobs that you have to take a personality test, and they're looking for certain sort of personalities before they give them the test. Fantastic. Now, Gordon, the father of the trait approach, and he came upon the insight that, you know what, if you go to the dictionary, you can see that there are thousands of words used to describe people's personality. There's happy, sad, energetic, grumpy, persnickety, cantankerous. There are thousands of words in the dictionary that describe people's personality. And he began to build this idea of what personality might look like. And he suggested we think about these things called central traits versus peripheral traits. He said there are some traits that we all seem to have. And he said these are general traits that we all have to some degree: extroversion, agreeableness, your conscientiousness. And he argued then what you probably see are traits that some people, that different people demonstrate in different situations. He called these peripheral traits. So you might be an honest person, but maybe you cheat at Monopoly or other board games, right? So I have this big personality trait. Chris is a conscientious person. But when he plays board games, he tends to cheat. So that's sort of what we might call a peripheral trait. And he even suggested that some people have traits that are so important that they mark them as unique human beings. These people have what we might call cardinal traits. To give you an example, maybe that relates to you, hell's his name? Kanye West, right? You might say that he was born to do music, and all he thinks about is music, and all he does is music. And music just weaves through everything in that guy's life from the time he gets up out of bed to the time he goes back to bed at night. So you might say that he has a cardinal trait. So Gordon Allport was the first guy to begin to think about organizing these descriptions in the dictionary to begin developing sort of a theory of what personality must look like. Now, he was the first person. He began to think about traits and how we should organize them. But what I want you to understand today is the difference between data-driven versus a theory-driven test construction. Now, some people who create personality tests have a theory about how personality must work. They then create the test questions to measure the theory that they have developed. This is what's known as a theory-driven personality test. I think that people have this quality and this quality, and then I'm going to develop a test that measures that. That's a theory-driven test. On the other hand, another way to make that test up is doing what's known as a data-driven test. And what these people do is they ask tons of questions, and based upon how people respond to these personality questions, they begin to build a test that measures what people seem to be like. So they let the data tell them what personality looks like. Let me give you an example of each of these types of tests. Right now, as you're looking below me, you're looking at Hans Eysenk's biological trait theory and personality test. Now, Hans Eysenck was a guy who tried to build the first guy to try to build his test from biological characteristics. He argued rightly that your personality starts in your biological material. Duh. Right? So therefore, the organization and structure of your biological material might actually determine your personality. And so he went in and looked at the brain, and he realized that human beings have a very important emotional system. Remember, we've been talking about that. That's the amygdala and the hippocampus and all these other parahippocampal areas. Together, we call these structures your limbic system. So we have an emotional center, right? And then he also realized that we have deep in our spinal column, in our hindbrain, we have this thing called our reticular system that is responsible for making us aroused, waking us up and putting us to sleep, depending upon whether or not we should be aroused or we awake or asleep. Now, both of these systems are not talked about in your textbook because they're considered sort of more advanced concepts, and they're not usually introduced in an intro psych class. But the point that I'm trying to suggest here is that human beings have these two biological structures in their brain, one that causes them to get emotional and one that causes them to get excited. And so Hans Eysenk's theory was designed with the idea that people possess some degree of excitability, some degree of and some degree of emotion. And so he developed the first personality test to sort of measure that. And you can see this test right down here. So you can see some people have what you might call unstable emotional functioning. They're high, they're low, they get happy easy, they get angry easy. Those people are what we might call emotionally unstable. On the other hand, some of you are hard to get excited. It's hard to make you really, really happy, but it's hard to make you really, really sad too. Your emotion is kind of stable. And what Isaac would argue is that your limbic system is not very active. And so he had this emotional stability dimension. Now, if you think about it, some of you really get nervous very easily. Some of you get really aroused and excited and then get really laid back. Some of you are interested in seeing new things, and some of you are not interested in seeing new things. Some of you like being surprised and excited. Some of you don't like being surprised and excited. And so he argued our desire to seek stimulation is based upon how easy it is to activate our reticular activating system. So what he would argue, what scientists have argued, is some people have a limbic system, a reticular activating system that is hard to activate. It is hard to get their arousal center to activate. These people need extra stimulation. They're what we would call extroverts. They need extra stimulation to cause that reticular activating system to activate and cause them to feel a sense of arousal. On the other hand, people who have a very sensitive reticular system, reticular activating system, they don't need much stimulation at all to activate their arousal. So these people might be called introverts. And so his biological theory of personality suggested that we can look in the brain, look at the brain structures, and create a theory of personality. And he developed a personality test that measured extroversion and emotional stability. This was his first biological type indicator. Right. Now, the problem with a theory-based test, he based this on the theory of how the brain must work. Now, the problem with a theory-based test is sometimes you get data which means your theory is wrong, and so you have to change your theory to accept the new data. Now, what psychologists pointed out is that there are some people in the world who are psychotic. Not only are people extroverted or emotional, but some people are just downright mean and evil. And if you look on this personality test, what you don't see is a place to put the people who are mean and evil and differentiate them from the people who are not mean and evil. Those people who break the law, those people who are sociopaths, those people who do evil things. This theory-based test didn't describe that. And so this one problem with his theory then made his test invalid, and he had to reevaluate and change his test in order to fit the new data. And so now Eysenck's type indicator had to include, he then developed a third scale and a third set of questions that he says measures psychoticism, your impulse control system. And he redoes his theory. He says, it's probably related to testosterone or dopamine systems. And so he had to revise his theory and revise his test because he based his personality test on a theory. Okay, and so this is one example of a biologically based theory. And you can see right here, I'm going to see, you know where the amygdala is. It's connected to the hippocampus, which is not actually on this picture, but I did want you to see a picture of the reticular activating system. It acts as a filter, and it causes you to get aroused or not get aroused. It's the collection of nuclei located in the brainstem that maintain arousal. A person with a higher base of reticular activating is associated with increased introversion. Their reticular activating system is already working, so they need less stimulation to achieve what we call optimal arousal. If you'll remember, I talked about optimal arousal the other day when we were talking about theories of motivation. And the argument here, the biological argument that he was using, is that human beings need a certain amount of stimulation to be properly aroused. And what your level of arousal is different from mine, is different from this person. And the brain apparatus that allows you to achieve optimal arousal may work better, may be more sensitive or less sensitive. And so what this guy did was he developed a theory of personality that was based upon how the brain worked, and then he develops test questions that he says measure that theory of personality. So one way to develop a personality test is to come up with a theory, an explanation of how personality must work, and then you develop the test to measure the theory. Have any of you ever heard of the MBTI, the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator? Anybody ever taken the MBTI? If you have, go ahead and type in the chat bar and let me know. The Myers-Briggs Type Indicator is also a theory-driven personality test. It was developed based upon the theory of Carl Jung, who was a psychologist who was one of Freud's peers. You think, yeah, and you get like an INTP or an ESFJ or an ESTN. You get these 4 letters that are supposed to give you a typology. It's a typology personality test, and it's based upon this theory of this old-time psychodynamic psychologist named Carl Gustav Jung. And it's a very popular test, although I'll be honest, I think the big 5 that we're getting ready to talk about is more useful. Okay, now, the second approach might be what's known as the data. Right. I'm sure that Lewis said he took it in 9th grade, so he probably doesn't remember it. I totally get it. Now, the second approach is to not have a theory, but to let the data tell you what the theory should be. So in the data-driven approach, what you do is you let the data tell you what personality looks like. You give the people a set of traits, let's say an adjective checklist or a set of situations, and let them respond, and then let the test questions tell you what the personality traits should be. Hold on just a second. That sounds kind of weird. But what I could do is I could give you 150 personality questions, and I could give each and every one of you 150 personality questions and have you take the test. And they could just measure a bunch of different situations, and I don't have any idea of what personality looks like. But I'm just going to give you 150 different situations and ask you to tell me how you would respond. And what you're going to find is that people will respond in patterns. For example, if I say that I don't like going to big parties, okay, and that's one of the questions, you're going to ask another question, probably, do you like to speak in front of people? Chances are, if I don't like going to big parties, I also don't like speaking in front of people. I also don't like going to dinner parties. I also don't like meeting new people. And what you're going to find is that there's a pattern in how I respond. Some of these situations that are similar, I'm going to act a certain way. And so what happens is if you ask me 100 questions, you're going to find that there are patterns in how I respond. And so these 5 items that have to do with going out and meeting people, I'm going to score either all low or all high on. And so what a data-driven approach does is they use a statistical technique called factor analysis. And what you can do is you look at the correlations among all of the questions that people ask, and you can find if there are patterns. Are there certain questions that people tend to answer similarly? And then what we do is we try to figure out what those patterns mean. So these 10 items that people tend to always score similar to themselves on, what exactly does this trait represent? So if I asked you to do 100 situations about all different things you could do in different aspects of your day, going out, talking to people, being interested, being happy, this and that, in all these situations, I would find that your behaviors would cluster and you would act in similar ways for clusters of these items. And then what I have to do is I have to figure out what that cluster means. All right. Now, the Big Five personality test that you're going to take for this week's discussion board, that hopefully you've already taken, measures your personality in 5 clusters. Now, you answered 120 questions for this particular test. All right. And let's see, there are 5 divided by 125. Was it 24 questions? So you were given 24 questions about each of these 5 categories. Now, you were given 120 questions. All right. And those 120 questions have been discovered to group into 5 broad categories. And then afterwards, the psychologists tried to figure out what do those categories represent. And some of these items represented when that you wanted to talk to people or whether you didn't want to talk to people. And so that category looked like an extroversion category. There was another category where people could sometimes show that they either had a bad temper or not a bad temper. And so those category cluster of questions was described as neurotic. And so in a sense, you have 120 questions, and statistical techniques have shown that we can break those 120 questions up into 5 categories of questions. One that asks about your openness to experience, one that asks about your conscientiousness, one that asks about your extroversion, one that asks about your agreeableness, and one that asks about your neuroticism. Now, here's the important point. We didn't know these categories before we perfected this test. The psychologists made these questions up, just asking people about all possible aspects of their daily life. And they found that the statistical factor analysis, the clustering technique, showed that they had 5 groups of questions. And they went in and looked at the similarity of the questions to figure out what those questions were asking about. And so the data-driven approach let the people taking the test decide what the 5 categories of personality were. Now, Hans Eysenck, in his test, he decided what the categories were before he made up the test because he had a theory of how the brain worked. So he said, we need some questions that ask people how extroverted we are, and then we need some questions that ask people how emotional they are. And he made those questions up with this belief in mind. On the other hand, the Big Five people said, let's just make up a bunch of questions that ask about how people act in their day-to-day life. We're going to give 1,000 people this test, and then we're going to do a factor analysis, a statistical technique to say over these 1,000 people, what are the categories that these people seem to be responding in? So with the data-driven approach, I let you, the participant, tell me what the 5 categories are. Now, there are actually statistical techniques, just give you general guides. So there are actually some people who say that we should measure the big 3. We only need 3 personality traits. Some people interpret the data and say, you know what, we actually need a big 7 or a big 9. But the most popular personality test clumps people's personality into 5 categories of responses. Some people are more open to new things. They're more open to new ideas. They're more open to new experiences. Other people are more conventional and like things the way they are. That's openness to experience. Some people have a very strong sense of self-control, of controlling their time, of controlling their budget, of making sure their area is neat. And other people are not like that. We'll call that the conscientiousness. Some people like to be stimulated by their environment and other people, and some people don't. That's your extroversion. Agreeableness. Some people are willing to give up their point of view in order to maintain social relationships. Other people want to fight for what they believe. That's agreeableness. And then some people suffer anxiety and anger problems, and some people don't. And that dimension is called neuroticism. And these are 5 general groupings. Now, if you take the personality test, if you take this personality test, and if you have the scores, I gave you a score sheet, what you're going to notice is that this personality test gives you 5 broad categories. Right. What happens when a person's test result is average in 5 categories? Well, that just means that compared to other people, you are more in the middle on your personality traits. It doesn't mean anything bad. It just means that your personality is less distinct, less unique. No, not less unique. I take that back. Less distinctive. Now, it's neat to have distinctive personalities, but that can be a problem too. So if you're in the average, that's fine. And if you're all extreme, that's fine too. The whole point of personality, and we'll talk about this next week when we get to abnormal behaviors, really your personality is a problem if it causes you to have difficulty in social relationships. So you can be extreme or average, and it really doesn't matter as long as you are able to have successful social interactions. If your personality prevents you from having social interactions that are healthy and normal, then we might say you have a personality disorder. It is okay. I am neurotic too, Marcella. I score high on neuroticism. I have sort of an angry neurotic. I lose my temper a lot. Now, I'm actually going to mention that. So here's the deal. The way to interpret your scores. Now, the reason this score sheet, if you look at the data sheet that I give you, it gives you 5 major scores, one for openness, one for conscientiousness, one for extroversion, one for agreeableness, and one for neuroticism. And then you'll notice that there are sub-scores down below those. And those are the traits that are said to feed into that larger trait. So underneath openness to experience, you're going to have 4 or 5 sub-traits. Now, here's the reason you have that. With this data-driven approach, they know that the numbers tell you how to interpret a personality, not somebody's theory. So, if you have that strong trait, what you're going to see is the test that you get is a standardized test. So, if you score 50, that means you're the 50th percentile. You're average for that trait. So, if your conscientiousness is 50, that means you are more conscientious than 50% of the people your age and less conscientious than 50% of the people your age. So you are in the 50th percentile, right? Now, when you look at your Big 5 test, look at your traits. Any trait that falls to the high or low is a trait that you can interpret. So my openness to experience is a 79. My neuroticism is a 70. You would say that I am a person who is open to new things, but also is kind of neurotic. You would interpret me as having those 2 traits. On the other hand, if you look at my extroversion, you'll notice that my extroversion is a 52. So, do you want to interpret me as an extrovert? You can't really use that because I sort of fall in the middle. So what you would do is you would say Chris is a person who has the neurotic trait, and Chris is a person who is open to experience. And then when you go to interpret my openness to experience, you don't use the whole trait. You instead look at the sub-qualities underneath it. And what you'll find is that I am not a full extrovert. In terms of being in social settings and liking parties, I am not that kind of extroverted. In terms of having a good attitude and being interested in activities, I am definitely extroverted that way. So when you look at those 5 traits, what you're going to see is that some of those traits relate to being extroverted in a social setting. I score low on those. And some of those traits score being extroverted in terms of activity and energy, and I score high on those. You put that together, and I have what's known as an average personality, an average introverted extroverted score. So each one of these traits, look at your personality traits. If you score high or low on a trait, you would say it makes sense to evaluate you as having that quality. When you describe Chris, you say, yes, he's a neurotic person who's very open to experience. But you wouldn't necessarily say I'm agreeable. You can describe my personality as agreeable or extroverted because my traits don't show a strong a strong tendency in that direction. And so the neat thing about the data-driven approach is I don't just force a number on you. I let the data tell me how to interpret your personality and your personality dimensions. Okay, how many of you have taken the Big Five right now? If you've taken the Big Five and you have your scores in front of you right now, go ahead and tell me one of your personality scores. Are any of you neurotic besides me? And who else was neurotic as well? Marcella. Is anybody else neurotic? How many of you score really high on openness to experience? I'm a I like new ideas, new thoughts, new sounds, new things. I just love new stuff. And so I'm very open to experience. On the other hand, some of you may be conventional. If your openness to experience score is low, you are just a conventional kind of person. You like things the way they are, and you're not really interested in thinking of new things and new ideas. Nothing wrong with you, like there's nothing wrong with me. We are just different that way. Gustavo hasn't taken it yet. Oh, man, you've got to take it and evaluate your personality. You will really find this test kind of interesting. I took this test when I was 35 years of age. Now, I've always had a bad temper. I've always been anxious and nervous, but I always thought it was the world's problem. If you would quit making me mad, if you would quit being late, if you would quit doing this, I would calm down. And when I was 35, I took this very personality test that I'm asking you to take. And when I took it, it told me that I was neurotic. I had never conceived of myself as being neurotic before. I showed the results to my wife and she started laughing and said, that is a perfect description of you. And at the age of 35, I finally discovered that I am the problem, that I have a neurotic personality. And it took me, and I've been working on it for the last 17 years. I still have a bad temper. I still get upset and angry, but I at least realize that about myself now. And so sometimes I'm able to stop myself from doing those really annoying, obnoxious things that I used to do before I knew I was neurotic. Okay, so Louis Tapia scored really high on conscientiousness. One of the things I find is that my students tend to score pretty high on conscientiousness. Students score high on conscientiousness. If you didn't, you wouldn't be in school, right? One of the things that I found here in the South, southern part of the United States, is that most of my students score below average on openness to experience. And I find that a lot of students score really high on extroversion. So I'd be curious to see what your pattern of scores are. I used to collect my students' patterns of scores and then do a little statistical analysis and show them. But I don't do that anymore. I hope you enjoy this test, and when you take it, make sure to save your results and have your friends and family members take it too. Maybe they'll learn something about themselves like I learned about myself. Now, so we have these data-driven tests and we have self-report tests. Now, the development of the Big Five, the Big Five is probably the most popular test right now. It is really, in modern psychology, the Big Five is really where it's at. For measuring personality as a general rule. And a lot of people have asked the same question about personality that they asked about IQ and other human qualities. So when we talked about IQ, I suggested to you that there was a genetic component to. Did you know there's a genetic component to psychological disorders, and there's also a genetic component to personality as well. And so behavioral geneticists have asked the question, is personality a result of nature or nurture? Were you born with a bad temper, or was that trained into you? All right. And so when I look at my older son's bad temperature, uh, my son's bad temper and his neurosis, his neurotic, I sometimes wonder, did I raise him wrong and make him into this person with a bad temper, or was he just born to be that way? Now, I will tell you that Roddenberries have probably 3 or 4 generation characteristic of having bad tempers and being angry, combative people. All of my brothers are angry, combative people. My dad was an angry, combative person. My grandfather he was an old fellow by the time I met him, but he was a spicy, aggressive kind of fellow as well. So you might ask the question, do Roddenberries just grow up in really twisted households, or is there some sort of genetic trait that makes us all angry, combative types of people? And behavioral geneticists would probably support the idea that the Roddenberry genes are the reason we are so neurotic and not anything that happens in our environment. So what they do in behavioral genetic study is they use the twin studies, and you can do adoption studies. So if you want to test how powerful genes are, you use twin studies. So you compare the personalities of twins, of identical twins, then you compare them to regular siblings or fraternal twins. Fraternal twins, which are 2 twins fertilized by caused by 2 eggs that are fertilized by 2 different sperms. So a fraternal twin is the same thing as a sibling. They just share womb service for 9 months. Okay, so you compare identical twins who have 100% of the same genes with siblings that only share 25% of the genes, with cousins that share even less genes. And what you do is you look at the similarity in personalities between these different groups with different genetic similarity. And if you look at the picture over here, what you're going to see is that the correlation between identical twins' personalities is much higher than it is for fraternal twins across each and every one of these 5 traits: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. So absolutely, yes, there is a genetic component to personality. Absolutely. Now, here's the crazy thing. Here's the crazy thing about personality, though, that they've noticed this nifty phenomenon with identical twins. It turns out that identical twins who are raised in the same household have more different personalities than identical twins who are not raised in this same household. So, although there is a high correlation between the personality scores of identical twins, the identical twins who live apart from one another have similar personalities than those who live together. More importantly, when you look at identical twins who lived together when they were growing up, what you'll find is that their personalities are more similar to one another as adults than they are to one another as children. Can anybody explain to me why identical twins' personalities might be more similar when they live apart than when they live together? That's an interesting phenomenon. I'd be curious to see if anybody is clever enough to have a guess about why that might happen. So yes, absolutely, there is a genetic link for personality as demonstrated by behavioral genetics studies of genes and scores on the Big 5 personality. However, we do have this weird thing where twins, when they live together, their personalities are a little bit different than when they live apart. I don't know if any of you have ever been around twins or had a pair of twins when you were growing up, but in my experience, these twins always had rhyming names and wore the same clothes. Uh, I would think because they're living in the same house, they try hard to differentiate from one another. So I had a set of friends in Charlotte when I was a little kid. Kenny and Denny were their names. Not only did they look alike, not only were they forced to dress alike by their parents who bought them the same outfits, but they even had rhyming names. Can you imagine the pressure these guys must have felt to want to be unique and different? So what they found is that personalities for identical twins living together are a little bit different than they are for identical twins who don't live together. They don't want to be too similar when they're living together. Exactly, Gustavo. That's exactly what it is. But when they move out and grow up, their personality reverts back, sort of trends back to where it should be. And you're going to find that their personalities will become even more similar. Now, the thing that makes me feel better about myself because I could be such an emotional parent was the adoption studies show that there is no correlation based upon environment. So another way to study the power of the environment is to look at adopted siblings. That is, siblings who have who share no DNA material, who share no genetic material, but they do share an environment. And so what you can do is you can look at correlations between adopted siblings to see if their personalities are more similar than they would be to the average strangers. And what you're going to find is that non-genetically related siblings show no correlation on personality traits. And more importantly, adopted children show no similarity in personality with their adopted parents. So it seems to be that personality is more strongly determined by your genes than it is by your environment. So, Marcella, you're neurotic and anxious. You and me, obviously, we have anxious genes built into our system. Our amygdala is set on high, and things upset us more quickly than they would for other people. Excuse me, I've got the hiccups now. And so that honestly makes me feel a little bit better because my older son has such a bad temper. Now, my younger son's just like his mom. He's unflappable. He has no temper at all. He is the happiest, most mellow kid I ever saw. He's just like his mom, and my older son is just like his dad. It's kind of weird how you can see the genetic trend in our personalities. Now, very anxious. There you go. So that's where you got it from, Marcella. Now, how does our personality change as we get older? Here's the weird thing. Our personality changes, and yet it doesn't change as we get older. Isn't that crazy? In an absolute sense, our personality does change. As all of us get older, our personality will change in a very systematic way. And if you look over on this far side, you'll see this chart comparing the change in personality in German, British, and Czech cultures. So they looked at this over 3 different cultures, and this is the change in conscientiousness that happens as you get older. And what I want you to notice in German cultures, in British cultures, and Czech cultures, as people get older, their conscientious level starts to change. Okay, so you and everybody, all of our personality is going to change as we get older. We're going to become more conscientious as we get older. We're going to become more agreeable as we get older. And we're all going to become less extroverted as we get older. In an absolute sense, everybody's personality changes as they get older. Here's the thing, though. If we're all changing at the same rate in the same way, what this means is compared to people your age, you are still going to be the same person at age 46 that you were at 14. So as I get older, I get more conscientious. Let's say I'm 50 percentile in conscientious as an 18-year-old, right? Now, in an absolute sense, I'm going to get more conscientious as I get older, but all of my colleagues are going to get more conscientious. So even though my score changes in an absolute sense, when I'm compared to my colleagues, my personality doesn't change. Does that make sense? And so what you're going to find is that personality can be a little all over the place in your teenage years, in your youth. And it doesn't start to become consistent until your teenage years. But once your personality sets in the teenage years, it kind of compares you to your peer group. And as your peer group gets older and changes, you're going to change in the same way, and you're still going to compare that way. So, Marcella, as you get older, you're going to become less anxious, less angry, less neurotic. However, you're still going to be more neurotic than any 40-year-old, than your other 40-year-old friends. Or when you get 50, you're going to be more neurotic than your 50-year-old friends. Does that make sense? So personality changes in an absolute sense, but it doesn't really change as we get older. It's kind of a weird thing about personality. Interesting. Maybe it's why I don't feel my personality haven't changed much. You weren't shy. It is really difficult to change personality traits. The cool thing is if you're aware of your personality trait, you can then try to make interventions where you can to make yourself more successful as a socially interactive person. Now, quickly, the test that you're going to take for the Big Five, the tests that we've been talking about so far are what we call self-report tests. In these tests, I give you a situation or give you a personality trait, and I ask you to directly tell me whether or not that trait relates to you. I might give you a sentence and ask you to tell me on a scale of 1 to 4 how likely you are to engage in this particular behavior. In this type of test, I'm asking you directly to tell me what your personality is like. That's known as a self-report test. And I could ask you things like, how do you usually behave? How do you behave in the past? How would you act in the future? Or what adjectives describe you? And what I do is I'm directly asking you to tell me about your personality. This has some advantages. It's very direct. It's very simple. And if you give me scale numbers to judge your personality, I can take these numbers, add them up, create averages, and then do things like comparisons that I've been talking about so far, showing how your personality changes, how people compare to one another. Self-reports are very useful that way. The only problem with the self-report test, like Marcella mentioned earlier, they're used in clinical settings. Sometimes people are being measured against their will. These people may seek to lie in order to change their diagnosis. Some people may be in a court setting and want to lie about their personality so that they look less guilty or more guilty, depending on what they want, right? People can lie on these self-report tests. So what I talked about last night were these things called projective tests. And this is where the test answers aren't so obvious. Instead, what I do is I give you an ambiguous situation and I let you act, and then I guess your personality based upon what you see or what you do. So, for example, have you ever been outside and you're looking up and you see clouds and you try to guess what shape the clouds are? Oh, that cloud looks like a lion. That cloud looks like a dog. That cloud looks like an elephant. In a sense, you are making sense. You are seeing shapes in ambiguous clouds. A projective personality test does the same thing. And basically, they try to figure out what your personality is based upon the kinds of answers you give in these ambiguous situations. Now, what you see right below me is one of the 10 ink blots used in the Rorschach ink blot test. So they have 10 ink blots. You tell me what those ink blots look like, and then I compare them to answers that I've gotten from thousands of people who have been diagnosed with psychological disorders. And based on what ink blots you see, I can tell you you might have this psychological disorder or this psychological disorder or this psychological disorder. Last night, we did a TAT test, a thematic apperception test, which is where I gave you an ambiguous picture of two ladies working in a lab, and I wanted you to write a story about those two ladies. One person wrote a story about how these ladies were having a good time and smiling and liked each other. And so this person was a little more agreeable. On the other hand, somebody else in class said, oh no, those two ladies were very angry. It was a tense, angry situation between those two ladies. And so that person might be a little less agreeable, might be more disagreeable. And basically, they interpreted the same picture different ways and they put their personality into the picture. And this is what's known as a projective test of personality. Now, projective tests of personality are harder to fool because you don't know what the right answer is. So tell me what you see in this picture below me. You don't know what the psychotic answer or what the normal answer is. I do, but you don't. And so it's harder for a participant to cheat one of these tests. The only problem is sometimes if you get two different psychologists using the Rorschach test, they will give the Rorschach test to the same person and they will come up with different diagnoses of what that person's personality is. Now, if it's a good test, they should have the same answer. But there's a little bit of unreliability that you'll find in projective personality tests. Now, what do psychologists do? When you go into a clinical psychologist like Marcella mentioned, and they're doing a full workup on you, they're going to give you self-report personality test, and they're going to give you projective personality test. And you're probably going to take 7, 8, maybe 10 or 15 different personality tests to see if there are themes that run across all of the personality tests that you can see on both the projective and the self-report tests of personality. I am so sorry I have run out of time. It is 9:55. I hope you learned something of value today. I hope you decide to go back and do the personality test tonight and find out whether or not you're a neurotic or an agreeable person. I hope that from now on, whenever you see a personality test, you'll be able to tell whether or not it's a self-report or projective personality test. And you'll be interested enough to ask and see if whether or not it's a theory-driven test or a data-driven personality test. That represents everything for Chapter 13. Don't forget to do your discussion board tonight by 11:59 p.m. And don't forget to do the homework that is due tomorrow night at 11:59 p.m. You folks have a great day. Gustavo, enjoy the Dominican Republic, and I hope to see you back here in the U.S. Take care, folks. Have a great day. Bye.